Does the name Richard James mean anything to anybody? Richard James. Richard James. It's too bad. He was actually quite an impactful person that you will know who he was, or at least what he did, as I'm going through this story. But Richard James was a mechanical engineer. He worked for the Navy, and he had one problem to solve. You see, during World War II, a lot of the time soldiers would get a shipment of ammo, they would go out to the front lines, and when they got there, their guns would jam. And so the Navy was working hard to try to figure out what is going on, why aren't these bullets firing? Nothing kills morale faster than knowing your gun doesn't work on the front lines. And so Mr. James was tasked with figuring this out. They realized that as the ships were going across the ocean, taking the ammunition from the States to the front, that they would bump with the waves. So a giant ocean swell would come, the crate would hit the corner, and the bullets would bend or break in some way that just made them completely unusable. And so James was tasked with figuring out a way to fix this. What he decided was a good solution is to get these springs so that all of the crates would sit on these springs so they could rock back and forth and they wouldn't hit anything. So one day, this is intense work, right? This is the war, and they're working long hours, so I'm no doubt he's stressed. He's probably sweating quite a bit. He knocks one of these springs off the desk onto the floor. Now, it's a spring. It should spring back up. But instead of springing, this spring started to walk. You might say it slinked away. And at that moment, James knew that he had stumbled upon something big. He went back and told his wife, "I think that I can make this spring walk down a ramp." And his wife, great supportive wife, said to his face, "Yes, go for it, honey." And secretly, she really had no faith in this whatsoever. But after some painstaking hours, well, lots of hours, James was able to perfect this 80-foot coil of metal to the right tension so that it would walk down a ramp. He took a gamble on this. Took $500. He took a $500 loan and made 400 of them. He was going to sell them at $1 a piece. He got an opening at a toy store to showcase this. His wife, supportive as always, told him to go. Secretly, she gave $1 to one of her friends so that her friend would go and at least somebody would buy one of these toys. This is what it looked like. This is the patent for the Slinky, taken from the American Patent Office. On opening day, they sold out all 400 Slinkies in 90 minutes. Turns out it was a brilliant idea. And all of us today know the Slinky. We know it because this man had an idea, acted on it, and it ended up working for him. This is called an entrepreneur when you do it in business. When you do this in the church world, it's called being an apostle. Some of us know, we actually all have experienced the effects of one apostle in the church today. His name is Peter Roberts. Somebody who felt a call to come and plant a church, to start something new, to go against the odds, and all of us have been impacted today. I think I would know 2 people in this theater today if Peter hadn't planted that church. So that goes to show the impact that it's already having. So we're going to talk about apostles today. Let's go back to Ephesians 4, verses 7 to 11. Remember our passage that we've been looking at last week, and then we also looked at a couple weeks before, so it'll refresh our minds. Starting here in Ephesians 4, verse 7. "But to each of us, grace has been given as Christ apportioned it. This is why it says, 'When he ascended on high, he took many captives and gave gifts to his people.' What does he ascended mean? Except that he also descended to the lower earthly regions. He who descended is the very one who ascended higher than all the heavens in order to fill the whole universe. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ." So last week, Rick preached on the evangelist and the role of the evangelist in the church. This week, we're looking at apostles. Now, we have to get one thing straight. Apostle is a word that has actually been used for quite a few ways, and today in churches you'll even hear it used differently depending on the tradition. Apostle comes from the Greek word, and it simply means sent one. Contextually, though, they need to have some kind of authority. You know, when we pray in Jesus' name, when we go in Jesus' name, we are sent ones with his authority. So this is what an apostle is. It's a messenger who goes from a king to another king saying, my king says this. Somebody who has authority. Big A apostle. See this little comparison? Grammar study. Big A apostle refers to the 12 apostles that started the church. 11 of them spent 3 years with Jesus, living with him, eating with him, walking with him, talking with him, learning everything that they could about him. And then, unfortunately, one of those 12 people, Judas, had a falling out with Jesus. That's a story you can read about in the Gospels. And the church, after Jesus' resurrection, replaced him with somebody else. They had one requirement for somebody who wanted to fill this big A apostle role. It had to be somebody who had walked with Jesus and had witnessed his miracles, had heard his teachings firsthand, and basically understood the gospel and what Jesus had come to do. They ended up selecting Matthias. And so now we have 12 apostles. These 12 apostles are the board of the early church. They are the authority. They decide what proper teaching is, if you're teaching properly. They doled out punishment, discipline when it was needed. They also are the ones who were tasked with taking the church to the ends of the earth. And that task was then passed down to the rest of us. So those are the big apostles. In essence, just think board of directors for the church. Little A apostles. Oh, and if you want to know what they looked like, there, we have a picture. Who knew? This isn't actually a picture of them. This is the Last Supper, Leonardo da Vinci. Now, little A apostles. This is what we're talking about today. These are the people who, much like Richard James, have an idea, have this side of them that loves to create, to expand, to strategize, and they create kingdom opportunities. This little A apostle is not a position to be filled, but it's a role that is needed in the church. I stress that because some traditions will actually have a position of apostle. That is not what we're talking about this morning. We're talking about the entrepreneurial role of, I see a need in the church, and I want to fill it. In case anybody wants to contest this idea that really we do have current apostles and this is a role in the church, there's a family, a couple in Romans 16, whom Paul says their names are Andronicus and Junia. And Paul says that these people are highly esteemed amongst the apostles. They are good, well-known apostles. Junia is a female name, by the way. So in case anybody wants to teach you otherwise, there are female apostles in the New Testament. Junia is one example. So Junia and Andronicus were probably leaders of a local church, of a house church. They had a church that met in their house, and they, in essence, oversaw the expansion of that church. That is the role of little A apostles. The church in Rome, where their church was situated, was started by little A apostles. As we read the book of Romans, we have this underlying idea that no big A apostle went and visited Rome to start the church. It was all done by people who came, heard the teachings in Jerusalem, and then went back. Probably merchants who had this apostolic side to them. And they brought the church there. That is little A apostle. Missionaries, church planters. These are little A apostles. So what I want to look at today are three simple functions that we see apostles doing in the New Testament. And if any of you relate to these, there might be this apostle inclination to you. If you know somebody who is, you can point them to these different stories that we're going to look at. Because as Paul says in Ephesians 4, when the church is working together, we all thrive. And we'll see this. So the first one, the first thing that we see apostles doing is optimizing the church's systems. Sorry, these are not very common words, but they're good technical ones you can remember. Apostles optimize. In Acts 6, we see this interesting story that really shouldn't be in a gospel church, and yet it is. The church had set up a system to feed the widows. So in this world, once you were a widow, you had very little economic value. You couldn't provide for yourself. You didn't have skills, you didn't have training, and most of the work was manual labor that you weren't suited for anyway. So the church started to feed them. They created, in essence, a food bank for these people. Over time, racism crept into the church. Racism is not a new thing, even amongst Christians. It's been around since the beginning. Racism crept in, and the Greek Jews claimed that the Hebrew Jews, or the Hebrew Christians, the Greek Christians and the Hebrew Christians, that was the racism. The Greek Christians claimed that the Hebrew Christian widows were being given better treatment than the Greek Christian widows. So right there we have this divide, the Greeks versus the Hebrews. And the apostles decided this is not our role. We are the sent ones. It is our job to expand. It's our job to bring the gospel to somewhere it hasn't been before. So they sat down and they chose 7 men that they think could run this a lot better than they could. Of these 7 men, the most famous is Stephen, and he, ironically, is a Greek name. So we know that they at least had some diversity on this board. They were tasked with tackling this racism and with making sure that the operation ran smoothly. It's quite interesting that one of the markers of being an apostle is being on the cutting edge of something. I didn't mention this with Richard James, but once Slinky got really big and successful, he actually left. He left it to his family, left his family, in fact. It's not something that we should admire. And he moved down to Bolivia and joined a religious cult, according to his family. I researched. I could not figure out what this religious cult was. But no doubt he had done his role, his entrepreneurial role, and was now moving on to the next thing. This is part of the DNA of an apostle. You start something, you get it going, and then you move on and let other people maintain it, because you actually aren't gifted at maintaining it. This is going to be a little bit of, I'm kind of guessing, I'm reading into the text a little bit, but I think that these 7 men that the apostles established to take over the feeding of the widows and to tackle this racism had prophetic and shepherding gifts. So what I see of this paradigm is that the prophets are a lot better at calling out sinful behavior in us than most of us are. They can call it out and identify it, and then shepherds are there to help us work through it. It's quite interesting. The apostles decided this is not our role. This is something better suited to others in the church. So they optimized it. They created a better system so that they could devote themselves to work that worked with their skills and their gifts. And you know what the next immediate verse is after they did this? The church in Jerusalem increased rapidly. Huge success. This roadblock that was hindering them because the apostles were devoting too much of their time to something which was not their gifting, not their role in the kingdom. Immediately after that was removed, they exploded with success. This is a little more evidence that finding your role and using it in the kingdom, finding your gifts and using them in the kingdom will bring fruit, will bring success, will just make everything a little better. Some of you have this apostolic inclination. Some of you don't. Some of you are going to relate more to the evangelist, to the shepherd, to the teacher, to the prophet, the ones we're going to talk about in the coming weeks. But those of you who hear a little bit of yourself in this optimization, I like strategy, this is what I do at work, I invite you to bring that to church. I invite you to bring your optimization to help figure out better ways to do things. Because traditionally, churches are run by shepherds, which is great when it comes to shepherding. is not good when it comes to systems. But you are wired a certain way. And if you are wired to optimize, to use your head, to think through these problems, I invite you to come forward and do that. Do that in our church. Do that in the church in general, in parachurch organizations, wherever you find yourself. Find ways to optimize and to let that apostle out of you. The next one. Use your hands as an apostle. You start to think, nobody is doing this. This is innovation. Innovation is what we have now isn't working, so let's try something new. Part of the apostolic role is looking into the future, anticipating change, and then making those changes now, so that you're set when it comes. We see this in Acts 15. This is the Jerusalem Council. It is the first meeting of the church. Everybody got together and had to discuss this one pressing issue. Should the Gentiles follow the Jewish law? You know, everybody, if you've ever read the Old Testament and think, why do we boil a goat in its mother's milk now? Why don't we follow this? You probably never had that thought. But that question was settled at the Jerusalem Council. What happened is Paul, the Apostle Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, so he was the one who was really encountering this issue, realized it was far too cumbersome to tell converts to Christianity to completely change all of this and follow Moses' law. There were a lot of things like boiling a goat in its milk, not wearing cotton and nylon in the same shirt, circumcision. There's a lot of things that would actually turn people away from Jesus and were completely missing the point of the gospel. So this movement is more than just Acts 15. You see it starting in Jesus. It goes in Acts 10 when Peter sees a blanket of animals coming down. So it's not like the apostles suddenly decided, okay, you don't have to follow the law. There is a movement. We can talk more about that, but not this morning. So if you have questions, come and ask me after. But in the end, they decided that out of the Mosaic law, all 600 and some laws that were there, they only wanted Gentiles to follow 4 of them. Abstain from food sacrificed to idols. Abstain from blood. That one's easy to do. Don't eat meat from strangled animals. And stay away from sexual immorality. They distilled the law of Moses to these 4 principles that they then passed on to the Gentiles. They did this because they saw that the way Jewish Christians were living was not going to be effective to reach the rest of the world. And so they innovated. They realized that there is social change coming. And so they adapted. It's important to see they did this with the Spirit. So in Acts 15, James, brother of Jesus, says, "It seems good to us and the Spirit that we lay these 4 principles before the Gentiles." But social innovation was very important in the spread of the church. Another simple example of this. Christians, you might not have heard this before, but Christians were accused by their political opponents of being cannibals for a while. This was because Christians would go and find discarded babies. In Rome, if a baby was born with something that did, and they, in their pre-scientific mind, thought that this meant they were either going to be a less intelligent baby or some kind of a sub-caste, they would actually cast away their child. They would just leave them in the wilderness for animals to come and eat. It's horrible. Christians realized this is wrong. Eugenics, wrong. So they went and they would rescue these children and they would raise them up. Now, Christians also had this thing called love feasts. We call it the Lord's Supper now, but in their day they called it love feasts. Everybody would get together, they would have a big meal, and they would remember Jesus. It's also where they did church meetings and much like that. So the fake news of the day, right, the propaganda, was that the Christians were taking these babies and eating them. But in reality, they realized there's something missing in this world. These children are dying. And so they stepped in to fill that role. They innovated. Very similar to Richard James, realizing there's no slinky in the world. I'm going to make a slinky. Entrepreneurs and apostles look at the situation and they say, what is missing here? What ministries are we missing? What is this church lacking? And how can we then provide that? They use their hands to innovate, to do. And we need apostles to step up now. I think more so than any time, our church is going through, the church in general is going through flux. And we need to create something that is sustainable to pass on to future generations. We need to counter current ideologies, humanism, these ideas that say you don't need God, you don't need faith. We actually need to counter these social movements, and we need apostles who can show us how to do that in effective and engaging ways. We need apostles who can show us how to take a smartphone and use that to build the kingdom instead of to tear relationships apart. We need people who can see where we are going, where the society is going to be in 10, 15, 20 years, and get the church ready for it now. And you might think to yourself, I'm not a pastor. That's the job for the professionals. But the truth is, this paradigm of the church transcends careers. Having career pastors is great for a few things, and it's bad for others. One of the bad things is people in the church let go of responsibility. But the truth is, there's so much potential in all of you here today if you were to step up and accept and function within these roles that God has created you in. And if you have any kind of apostolic calling, please come forward, because we need you. Lastly, an example we see of Scripture. Apostles expand. And when I say this, I mean apostles go where nobody has been before. Paul says, "It has been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundations." He says that in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. He physically went where nobody else had been to share the gospel, to establish churches. This is the missionary. This is the church planter. All of us have experienced the results of church planting, and hopefully all of us have heard a little bit the effects of missionaries. But Bruce and Betty Adams, you wouldn't have heard of. You wouldn't have heard of them. Bruce and Betty Adams, when they were 20 years old, graduated from Bible college, flew across, actually I don't think they could fly yet. They took a steamer across the ocean to Ethiopia, and they spent their entire working lives creating a Bible for a people group there who didn't even have a writing system, let alone any access to the gospel. They spent their entire lives going where nobody had gone before to fill a gap that nobody had filled before. And I actually have one of the copies of the first Bible in that language. They were my grandparents. That is apostleship. That is somebody who has the apostle calling, touching into that DNA that God has put in them and them acting on it. And the church is better off for it. We mentioned Peter in church planning earlier. All of us are better off, hopefully. We'd say you're better off. Because Peter heard that apostle calling and he followed it. He realized there is a need in the northern hills for churches. And he stepped in to fill that need, like an apostle. I think apostles need to go not just physically to different places, but also to different social networks. Because there are networks, there are groups of people in this city who have never heard the gospel. The gospel has not affected them whatsoever. Apostles need to physically go places like a missionary. They also need to go places socially like a church planter. Some of you have engaged with church planting a little bit, others haven't. We only exist because somebody planted this church. And this church is going to be planting another church in a few years. And then hopefully that church will be planting another church. And we will continue to be stretching out and bringing the gospel to different social networks where they have it's never been before. If that is anything at all that interests you, I think you should find ways to get involved. Missions I wouldn't be surprised if there is somebody here that the Spirit is calling to actually get up and go. Physically answer this apostle calling by getting up and leaving the country to serve in long-term missions somewhere else. I wouldn't be surprised if the Spirit is priming somebody here to get up and engage in church planting and to take the gospel to new social networks where there hasn't been before. But listen to that apostle calling if you have it. If there's anything that you see in this that reflects you, it's worth reviewing a little more. I'm going to close here. I'm going to call the worship team back down. I'm going to lead us in one more song. But if you have an apostolic inclination, I encourage you to find ways to optimize, find ways to innovate, and find ways to expand the kingdom of God where you're at. Guys, pray with me as I ask the Spirit to inform you if this is actually you.